They called it a promotion dinner, but it felt more like an execution. My name shimmered in gold script on the menu, Emma Hayes, Vice President of Operations Orion Air, as if the letters themselves were mocking me. I'd spent 7 years rebuilding that company after my father's death, turning chaos into profit, loyalty into structure. But that night, as champagne glasses clinked and polite laughter rippled across the room, I realized I wasn't the guest of honor. I was the distraction. My stepmother's eyes gleamed like glacial ice when the board chairman raised his glass and said, "To new leadership and the future of Orion." The words tasted like ash and copper, and I hadn't even swallowed the wine yet. The restaurant overlooked the runway. Through the wide glass windows, I watched a plane take off its tail, glinting silver in the dusk. It felt personal, a symbol of everything I had built taking flight without me. My father's old friends filled the long table, men who used to call me kiddo when I brought them coffee during summer internships. They were older now, slower and far too comfortable, pretending they hadn't sold me out. At the head of the table sat Victoria Hayes, my stepmother, widow of the legendary Robert Hayes, founder of Orion Air. She'd been 28 when she married him. I was 21, freshly out of MIT, still naive enough to believe brilliance alone could protect me. Victoria had never forgiven me for being his daughter instead of hers. She raised her glass. "Emma, you've done so much for Orion. Your father would be proud." Her voice carried that velvet-coated cruelty she'd perfected over the years, the kind that made applause sound like pity. Around her wrist glimmered my mother's old bracelet. I'd sold the matching necklace to pay rent my first year out of school. When the chairman cleared his throat to announce the new CEO, my stomach tightened. After careful consideration, he said the board has decided to bring in new blood to guide Orion's next era of innovation. I knew before he said it. Alan Vance, former CFO, Victoria's longtime consultant, the man whose hand had lingered too long on her shoulder during meetings. The applause started slowly, awkwardly, as if everyone understood what this really was, a coup dressed in silk and candlelight. Alan smiled at me across the table. "No hard feelings, Emma. You'll still have your place here, just under new guidance." The humiliation was surgical, public, final. I sat still, smiling, like the good corporate daughter I'd trained myself to be. The waitress refilled my glass, but my throat had already closed. I caught my reflection in the window, calm, polished, untouchable, while inside something cracked so loudly I could almost hear it. After dinner, I walked alone to the parking lot. Snow had started to fall, soft at first, then thicker, heavier. My heels sank into the slush. Behind me, laughter echoed from the restaurant doors, Alan's deep, confident chuckle mingling with Victoria's brittle one. I didn't look back. The Orion headquarters loomed across the street, its logo still glowing, a pair of silver wings split by a rising sun. My father had once told me, "Emma, the sky doesn't forgive arrogance." I hadn't understood what he meant until now. I drove home in silence, headlights cutting through the storm. My apartment was still half unpacked. I'd been planning to move into a company-owned penthouse next month. That dream dissolved somewhere between the entree and dessert. The email arrived at 11:47 p.m. A corporate form letter from HR, effective immediately. "Your position has been restructured. Thank you for your service to Orion Air." No signature, no explanation, just a severance clause and a non-disclosure reminder. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, 7 years of loyalty reduced to 12 lines of legal language. The phone rang once my father's lawyer. "Emma," he said quietly, "Victoria has executed the final clause of your inheritance. The trust transfers control of Hayes Holdings to her." "I'm sorry." My mouth went dry. "That's impossible." "My father. Your father's will was amended 6 months before his death. You were removed as successor. Removed." The word landed like a bullet. After I hung up, I sat in the dark, the city's hum filtering through the cracked window. Across the skyline, airplanes blinked red and white, carving paths through the night routes I used to manage, systems I designed. Each one was a reminder that the world kept moving, indifferent to my collapse. I thought about calling someone. Noah may be the only executive who had ever treated me as an equal, but I could already hear his voice in my head level like a flat horizon. Emma, walk away. You can build again. Easy for him to say. Men like Noah got second chances. Women like me were expected to disappear quietly. At 2:00 a.m., I opened the last message my father had ever sent me weeks before his plane crash. Never let anyone ground you, even me. I closed the laptop, stood by the window, and watched another plane take off its contrail, glowing faintly against the storm clouds. My pulse steadied. If they wanted me gone, fine. Let them celebrate their new empire. But they'd forgotten one thing: every system at Orion Air, every algorithm, every safety code, every patent filed in the last decade carried my name somewhere deep inside it. And in the silence of that snow-covered night, I made myself a quiet promise they might own the company. But the sky would still answer me. The first morning after losing everything felt like waking from turbulence into silence. My phone lay face down on the table, a slate of indifferent black glass. By noon, even the sympathy texts had stopped. The city outside my window went on breathing taxis' horns' voices, while my world had been reduced to a pile of contracts, a revoked keycard, and a name erased from a building's directory. I brewed coffee that tasted like a weak lie flat and over-extracted, leaving behind a dry grit of frustration and burned toast, then sat on the floor surrounded by boxes I never unpacked. My father's photo stared back at me from the bookshelf, him standing beside the first Orion prototype wind in his silver hair, pride in his eyes. That picture used to give me strength. Now it just reminded me how powerfully men could vanish, leaving women to clean up their legacy. The rent was due in 4 days. My severance wouldn't cover even 1 month. I'd spent my 20s building an empire, not a savings account. Every check had gone into Orion upgrades, staff bonuses, PR rescues after Victoria's disasters. I'd been the engine, but the ownership had always been elsewhere. At 3 p.m, I put on a coat and walked to a nearby cafe. The barista smiled politely, not recognizing me. A familiar voice pulled me from my thoughts. Didn't expect to find you grounded. Noah. He looked tired, dark circles beneath eyes that now seemed hollowed out. He'd left Orion 6 months earlier, claiming ethical differences. I heard he said, sliding into the seat across from me. They moved fast. They always do when the blood's still warm, I replied. He watched me for a moment. You could sue. Wrongful termination, intellectual theft, breach of contract. Against my own stepmother, she'd drag me through court until I couldn't afford oxygen. He nodded slowly, then pushed an envelope across the table. You're going to want to see this. Inside were printouts, financial statements, encrypted memos, internal transfers. My name appeared on a dozen projects labeled secondary ownership, except the funding came from shell accounts registered in Victoria's name. She's selling Orion's flight data, Noah said quietly, to foreign defense contractors. The same technology you designed for civilian autopilot. The air in the room seemed to evacuate entirely. That's impossible. It's already happening. The project you called Skylink, she renamed it Horizon Initiative. The files were signed by Alan Vance last week. My stomach turned. That system wasn't built for weapons. It could take control of entire fleets remotely. Noah leaned in. I left because I found out. But if you go public, you'll need proof more than this. Then I'll get it. He shook his head. They'll destroy you. They already did. That night I went back to my apartment and opened my old Orion drive. Most access codes had been revoked, but a few back doors I'd written still worked. Line after line of data scrolled across the screen. Contracts, flight algorithms, proprietary code signatures. In the bottom corner, I saw my digital watermark EH329. My initials, my birth date. Still there. Still mine. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside snow had turned the street into a sheet of quiet light. I found hidden transfers from Hayes Holdings into offshore accounts labeled HB Reserve. The amounts were staggering, tens of millions. Buried beneath the numbers was one phrase that froze me: Project Horizon Black. It was dated 6 months before my father's crash. I copied everything onto a secure drive, encrypted it, and hid it inside an old music box my mother had given me as a child. The tune, Fly Me to the Moon, played when I closed the lid, eerie and defiant. By dawn, I was on my 3rd cup of coffee, the apartment littered with papers. A single email draft sat open on my laptop, addressed to a journalist I knew from a conference years ago. I typed a subject line, "What Orion Air Doesn't Want the World to Know." But before hitting send, I hesitated. Whistleblowers become martyrs, not survivors, and I'd already buried enough ghosts. The doorbell rang. No one ever visited. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a delivery uniform holding a small package. When I opened the door, he handed me a padded envelope. No signature required. Inside was a flight manual. My flight manual from the first Orion prototype. The one I'd kept locked in my father's study years ago. Tucked between the pages was a note written in his familiar heavy script: "The sky remembers. Find horizon." My pulse jumped. My father's handwriting had been declared missing along with the rest of his records after the crash. I turned the envelope over, no return address, no sender. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't rage or grief. It was for a purpose. At sunrise, I packed a duffel bag, laptop, hard drives, notebook, and one change of clothes. I left my keys on the counter, the lease on the table. The landlord could keep the deposit. I was done living in rooms built from other people's lies. Outside, the world was quiet, suspended between night and day. A cab stopped at the curb. The driver rolled down his window. "Where to?" I looked at the horizon where the first plane of the morning lifted into the pale light. Its engines roared a sound that used to mean everything and now meant freedom. "JFK," I said. "One-way ticket." As the cab pulled away, I glanced back once at the building, the skyline, the life I was leaving. My reflection in the window looked nothing like the woman who'd been humiliated at that dinner. That woman was gone. This one had nothing left to lose and an entire sky to reclaim. The will reading took place in a law office that smelled like old paper and carefully managed dust. Snow flurries clung to my coat as I walked in, the receptionist too polite to ask why the daughter of Robert Hayes had to sign in as a visitor. The mahogany walls were lined with photographs of my father shaking hands with governors and CEOs. His smile was the same in every frame, confident, unreachable. Inside the conference room sat Victoria, dressed in black silk, despite the afternoon sun spilling through the blinds. Beside her, Alan Vance scrolled through his phone like a man checking the weather. The family attorney, Mr. Callahan, cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit. "We're here to finalize the distribution of Mr. Hayes's estate," he began, eyes flicking nervously toward Victoria. "As you know, your father executed a revised will 6 months prior to his passing." I leaned back in the chair. "Revised by whom?" "By Mr. Hayes himself," Callahan said quickly, though the tremor in his voice gave him away. Alan smirked. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Emma. Your father trusted Victoria to handle his affairs." "My father trusted her to arrange dinner parties," I said, "not rewrite his legacy." Victoria's hand twitched around her thick, cold knot of pearls. Robert was a visionary, but he wasn't sentimental. He knew Orion needed guidance beyond family emotion. Family emotion. The phrase scraped against my chest like sandpaper. "Meaning me." She smiled faintly. "Meaning stability. Something you've never understood." Callahan shuffled papers, trying to drown the tension in rustling pages. "Per the revised documents, Ms. Hayes." "Mrs. Hayes," she corrected smoothly. "Mrs. Hayes retains controlling interest in Hayes Holdings, including subsidiary rights to Orion Air." I kept my face still, even as the words detonated inside me. "And me?" Callahan hesitated. "Your father left you the lake house property in Vermont, and a personal letter to be read privately. The lake house, a frozen ruin of glass and timber, abandoned after my mother died. A museum of grief." Victoria rose gracefully. "You see, Emma, Robert wanted you to have peace, not pressure. The company was never meant to consume you. I wanted to laugh, but the sound turned to filings on my tongue. You mean it was never meant to escape you? Alan slid a slim folder across the table. Sign these and the transfer will be complete. You'll receive a financial settlement and full release of liability. It's a pity offer, but take it, considering that you nearly bankrupted Orion 2 years ago with your expansion into green fuel. We saved you then. This is us saving you again. The heir left the room. My expansion had kept Orion alive, pulled it from debt when fuel prices spiked. But truth never mattered to men like Alan. They rewrote history in the boardroom and called it business. I stood. Send the documents to my attorney. I'm not signing anything today. Alan leaned back, smug. Walk away, Emma. Don't make us remind the press about your father's investigations. I met his gaze unflinching. You can't threaten someone who's already been buried. When I reached the door, Victoria's voice followed softly. Your father loved you in his way, but you were always too much like him, too proud to survive. I didn't turn around. Then I guess he finally got what he wanted. Another ghost to haunt his empire. Outside, the wind was sharp, slicing through my coat as I crossed the street. I stopped at the steps of a church, the bells echoing somewhere far above the traffic. I opened the envelope Callahan had handed me, the letter from my father. The handwriting was firm, familiar. If you're reading this, Emma, then the company is no longer yours. That was the only way to protect you from what I couldn't undo. Orion carries debts the world can't see. Let Victoria shoulder them. Walk away. Live. I read it twice, then tore it in half. If he'd wanted to protect me, he would have trusted me. By nightfall, I was driving north the highway, unfurling like a scar through the snow. The lake house waited at the end of a long, frozen road. When I pushed open the door, the air smelled of cedar and old rain. My father's study was just as he'd left it. Books, charts, aviation journals, the model of the first Orion prototype still on the desk. Dust coated the wings. I lit a fire and searched the drawers. Beneath tax forms and half-finished sketches, I found another envelope marked simply Horizon Black. My breath caught. The same name I'd seen hidden in the Orion accounts. Inside was a single photograph, a hangar in the Arctic Circle, the tail of an aircraft barely visible behind snow. On the back, my father's handwriting again. If you ever need the truth, follow the sky north. The fire crackled, louder shadows flickering against the walls. Somewhere outside, the lake groaned beneath its frozen surface, a deep, ancient sound that felt like warning. I sat there until dawn, the photograph feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. My father had built his empire on flight, but every secret he left behind seemed anchored to the ground, heavy buried, waiting for someone foolish enough to dig. By morning, my decision was clear. I wasn't done. Not with Victoria, not with Orion, not with the lies that carried my father's name. The world thought I'd fallen. They didn't understand the fall wasn't the end. It was the runway. And this time, I wasn't looking for permission to take off. I was going to build my own wings. By the time the snow melted around the lake house, I had stopped mourning and started planning. Every wall inside that place was a reminder of what had been stolen, my inheritance, my father's name, the life I'd built piece by piece. But grief was useless fuel. It burned too fast. What I needed was the cold, steady burn of a jet engine. Precision. I dragged a drafting table from my father's study to the main room. The first Orion prototype hung above the fireplace, its silver wings glinting in the morning light. I'd stared at that model since childhood, tracing every line of its design, memorizing how it lifted, how it turned. Now I was doing the same with the blueprints of my revenge. My first target was Alan Vance. The man who'd replaced me smiled through my destruction and codified my father's ruin. His emails, his transactions, his personal network, I wanted it all. Noah had given me access to a shadow folder hidden in Orion's servers before I left New York. For emergencies, he'd said. He didn't ask what kind of emergency. He didn't need to. I opened the files on my laptop, scrolling through coded reports until one line stopped me cold. Horizon Black. Transfer authorization by Vance. Secondary account Hayes Holdings. The same phrase again. The same ghost trailing me from every direction. I opened a blank notebook and wrote 3 words at the top. Find, expose, reclaim. For weeks, I lived between the stale chemical taste of caffeine and the blue glow of the console. I broke into Orion's archived systems through old engineering access points pathways I had built years ago and never told anyone about. Passwords changed, servers shifted, but the foundation was still mine. They could take the name off the door, but not out of the wiring. By day, I posed as a freelance consultant for regional airlines, fixing logistics problems and earning enough to cover the basics. By night, I dismantled the empire that had erased me. Every new piece of data I uncovered went onto a growing map of lines and arrows pinned to the cabin wall. Alan was laundering money through shell accounts linked to private defense contracts. Victoria's signature appeared on legal documents transferring experimental technology overseas. And at the bottom of everything sat the words, Horizon Black encrypted, classified unsigned. It wasn't about my father's death anymore. It was about a machine capable of overriding flight control systems worldwide, a weapon disguised as progress. Sometimes when exhaustion blurred the screen, I'd hear my father's voice from old memories, "Don't let ambition blind you to altitude, Emma. Every plane that climbs too fast meets thinner air." I used to think he meant business. Now I wondered if he was warning me about himself. One night as the fire died low, headlights swept across the windows. I reached for the nearest thing that could pass as a weapon, a fireplace poker, and stepped quietly toward the door. A knock. Then another. "Emma, it's me." Noah's voice. When I opened the door, he looked older, rougher around the edges. His coat was soaked from the rain, his eyes sharp but uncertain. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "Neither should you," he replied, stepping inside. "You've made a lot of noise. Orion's been locking down their data centers. Alan thinks someone's leaking." "Good," I said. "Let him wonder which ghost came back to haunt him." He scanned the room, the blueprints, the pinned notes, the coded spreadsheets. "You're building something." "I'm rebuilding everything I said, and I'm not asking for help." He leaned against the table. "You think this ends with an exposé? If Horizon Black is what I think it is, this goes beyond Orion. You're walking into a classified operation. People vanish for less." I met his gaze. "Then I'll vanish loud enough for the world to notice." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he pulled a flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Encrypted flight logs from Hayes Holdings. Found them in the archives before I left. They reference the same Arctic coordinates from your father's old project." I stared at the drive. "Why give this to me? Because I know you'll actually use it." He turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Just remember, Emma, revenge doesn't restore altitude. It only keeps you flying in circles." After he was gone, I loaded the drive. Files flickered open, revealing raw data engine tests, weather anomalies, recorded transmissions. The last entry stopped me. Date, 2 days before Robert Hayes's crash. Message, Horizon Black operational. Skylink protocol initiated. Containment required. Containment. My father hadn't died in an accident. He'd tried to stop something and someone had silenced him for it. The next morning I drove into town and bought a one-way ticket to Iceland. The hangar in that photograph was real, and I needed to see it with my own eyes. Before leaving, I stood by the frozen lake behind the cabin, the morning sun slicing through the mist. My reflection stared back from the ice, not the corporate heir who once sat in boardrooms, but a woman cast in the unflinching metal of necessity. I whispered into the cold air, "You built the sky, Father. Now I'll show them who it really belongs to." The wind answered with a low howl carrying across the water like the deep vibration of a distant rotor. I didn't flinch. I locked the door, tucked the flash drive inside my jacket, and walked toward the waiting cab. The horizon ahead was pale and endless, a thin strip of light between storm clouds. It looked like a promise, or a threat. Either way, I intended to follow it. The wind in Reykjavik felt sharper than memory slicing through my gloves as I stepped out of the small plane. The airport was half empty, all steel and silence. My breath turned to fog the moment I exhaled, curling into the air like a momentary white flag. Somewhere beneath the frost and distance, my father's secret waited, the one that had killed him, and buried my name with his. I rented a truck from a company that didn't ask for identification beyond a credit card. The clerk handed me the keys without eye contact. "Be careful," he said quietly. "The North doesn't forgive mistakes." I drove until the road ended, then kept going. The landscape unfolded like shattered white armor, white ridges of snow veins of dark rock, and a horizon that never seemed to move. The coordinates from my father's files pointed to an abandoned research facility near the Arctic Circle, marked only as Station 47. By dusk, I reached what looked like the edge of the world. A row of steel hangars, half buried under snow, stood in the distance, their windows shattered, their walls painted with the wind. My headlights caught a sign bent almost flat to the ground: Horizon Technologies. Authorized personnel only. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Inside the first hangar, the air smelled like fuel and rust. My flashlight caught the skeletal remains of equipment, dismantled rotors, and the shattered glass of old monitors. On the far wall, faded letters spelled Project Horizon Black. It was real. All of it. I brushed snow from a workbench and found a stack of blueprints, half burned but legible. They showed an aircraft unlike anything I'd ever seen: no cockpit, no manual controls. Full automation. Autonomous flight command, capable of overriding any manned system. The note scrawled at the bottom made my heart stop: prototype linked to global satellite relay. Final test pending authorization. RH. RH. Robert Hayes. My father hadn't built a passenger aircraft. He'd built a weapon. A creak echoed behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the dark. Noah stepped out from behind a turbine, snow clinging to his coat. "You really don't listen, do you?" I lowered the flashlight, but not my guard. "How did you find me?" "You used Orion's satellite pings to locate this place," he said, brushing ice from his beard. "They still monitor those frequencies." I rerouted the trace before they could. I stared at him. "So they know someone's here." "Not yet, but they will." I turned back to the console, typing commands into the still active system. To my shock, it flickered to life, faint but alive. The power source was buried somewhere beneath the floor. "This still runs on the Skylink core," I said. "My algorithm." "You need to shut it down," Noah said firmly. "If Orion finds out you've accessed this, they'll classify you as a threat." "I already am," I muttered. A new window appeared on the console. User access detected. Level 7. Authorization required. My father's password had always been the same: sequence, altitude, wind speed, date. I typed the day of his crash. The monitor blinked, then opened a folder titled Final Transmission. I hit play. Static filled the air, then my father's voice, faint, strained, but unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, it means they've taken Horizon. Victoria. She sold the control codes. Alan knows, but he won't stop her." I tried to disable the prototype. They grounded me instead. A long pause. "Emma, if you ever find this, don't finish what I started. Destroy it." The recording ended with the sound of wind and a single sharp impact, metal against metal. Then silence. My hands trembled on the console. Noah watched me, his posture rigid. He was trying to protect me. I said the words barely audible. He built something that could erase borders, control entire fleets, and then realized too late what it meant. Noah stepped closer. "Now you know why they needed you out of the way." Before I could answer, a low rumble filled the hangar. Outside lights appeared in the distance, 2 black SUVs crawling through the snow. "They're here," Noah said. I grabbed the flash drive, yanked it from the console, and stuffed it inside my jacket. "We need another exit." He led me to the back of the hangar, where a half-collapsed door opened toward the frozen cliffs. The drop below was sheer, the ocean churning far beneath. "Do you trust me?" Noah shouted over the wind. I don't have time not to. He tied a rope to a beam and started rappelling down. I followed, boots slipping on the ice. By the time we reached the bottom, headlights glared above us, voices echoing. Men shouting orders in the storm. We ran along the rocky shore until the noise faded. My lungs burned from the cold, each breath a sudden metallic scrape. When we finally stopped, the horizon glowed faintly pink with dawn. The world looked untouched, a cruel lie. I pulled out the flash drive, holding it between us. This proves everything I said. My father, Orion the weapon. I can end them. Noah shook his head. Or they'll end you. That's how this game works. Then I'll rewrite the rules. We walked in silence toward the waiting truck hidden behind a ridge. The engine sputtered but came to life. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. As the hangar disappeared behind us, I realized my father's final warning wasn't about Horizon. It was about me. He'd wanted me to walk away from the storm. But storms don't frighten the sky. They remind them what power feels like. And as I drove into the white expanse, I knew the reckoning had just begun. The flight back to New York felt endless, a blur of clouds and unresolved fury. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice from that recording, the static between his words, the sound of metal colliding, the final silence. I replayed it again and again, memorizing the terror that had lived in his tone. He hadn't been afraid of dying. He'd been afraid of what he'd built. When I landed, the city was awake in its usual chaos. Horns, shouts, the rush of people pretending to matter. I slipped into it like smoke unseen. I couldn't afford to be found, not yet. The flash drive burned cold in my pocket, carrying proof that could destroy Orion and everyone tied to Horizon Black. My first stop was a small apartment in Brooklyn, a place I'd rented under a different name months ago, back when paranoia had started to feel like instinct. The curtains stayed drawn. The walls were bare except for one corkboard filled with maps, photographs, and names connected by red string. Alan, Victoria, Orion. And now a new one, Horizon Technologies, Global Division. I powered up my laptop and connected the drive. Files unfolded like a confession, flight data, prototype specs, encrypted communications. Buried inside was a list of international contractors. One stood out immediately, Dahlstrom Aeronautics, classified collaboration agreement, approved by A. Vance. Alan had sold parts of Horizon's technology overseas, disguising it as joint research. The contracts bore Victoria's digital signature, but I knew who had really orchestrated it. The empire my father built was now a global arms scheme wrapped in the illusion of progress. I sat back in my chair, exhaustion pressing into my bones. For the first time since finding the recording, a chilling weight settled on my chest. What if exposing them wasn't enough? What if the people funding this machine were too powerful to fall? A knock broke the silence. 3 short taps. My pulse jumped. "Who is it?" "It's Grace," a voice whispered. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Grace, my father's former assistant, the one Victoria had fired 2 years ago under conflict of interest. She looked older, wary, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. "May I come in?" I stepped aside. "How did you find me?" She smiled faintly. "You forget who handled your father's private accounts. You've been paying the electric bill through a shell company he created. Robert Hayes's fingerprints are all over your life even now." She sat at the small table and slid the envelope toward me. I kept copies of everything. Meeting minutes, internal memos, even the black box recordings from his last flight. My throat tightened. "You had those?" "Your father asked me to safeguard them," she said softly. He knew what was coming. I opened the envelope. Inside were printed transcripts and a small audio chip. The transcript detailed a meeting between my father, Alan, and a man listed only as Agent 47. The conversation turned my stomach. RH. The prototype isn't stable. It shouldn't leave simulation, AV. The investors disagree. The contract's been signed. Agent 47. Then you'll ensure successful activation, Mr. Hayes. If not, others will. The chip contained the raw audio, my father's voice, again calm but defiant. You're not turning my system into a weapon. Then the sound of a scuffle, a metallic crack, the same one from the recording at the hangar. Grace covered her mouth as it played. He knew too much. I stared at the tiny chip. This isn't just proof of corruption. It's murder. She nodded. And the same people are still funding Victoria. I stood pacing. Then it's time to make them choke on their own legacy. Grace hesitated. You're planning something dangerous, aren't you? I'm planning something necessary. By midnight, I was outside the Orion headquarters, hood pulled low. The city lights reflecting off the glass tower that had once been my home. The new logo glowed like a wound. Inside that building were the servers, the documents, the people who destroyed my father and called it progress. I entered through the sub-level access where maintenance trucks unloaded supplies. The security guards were predictable, lazy, distracted, trusting that power meant invulnerability. I bypassed the first checkpoint with an old badge still encoded from my engineering days. The system recognized my credentials without hesitation. On the 12th floor, I reached the data vault. It was colder there, quieter. Machines hummed softly like heartbeats buried beneath steel. I plugged in my laptop and began transferring files from the central archive. Minutes stretched into hours. Then a soft voice echoed from behind me. Still hacking ghosts, Emma Allen. He stood by the doorway, hands in his pockets, that same smug smile. You really should have stayed gone. You're good, but you were never subtle. Neither were you, I said. You left a trail of blood in every bank account. He stepped closer. Do you really think anyone cares about your moral outrage? The world runs on deals, not justice. Your father learned that too late. I turned, meeting his eyes. And you're about to learn it just in time. He glanced at my laptop screen, realization dawning. You're downloading the Horizon archives. That's classified. Classified doesn't mean untouchable, I said. He lunged toward me, but I was faster. I yanked the laptop free and slammed the emergency release on the data tower. Sparks burst, alarms blaring. Allen shouted something, but the alarm noise sheared his voice into nothing. I ran. Down stairwells, through corridors, past startled guards shouting into radios. By the time I reached the street, the sirens were echoing through Midtown. Smoke curled from the top floors of the building, not fire but panic. I ducked into an alley, breath ragged. The laptop in my arms is still warm, driving light pulsing like a captured heart. The transfer had been completed before the system crashed. I had everything. Note, the systemic crash ensures their immediate tracing efforts are significantly hampered, creating a window for escape. Above me, the Orion logo flickered in the night sky like a dying star. For years it had been the symbol of my family's pride. Now it looked like a warning. I whispered to the city, to my father, to the empire that had tried to bury us both. Your sky's falling, Allen. And this time, I'm the gravity. Then I disappeared into the smoke. The files went live at 8:15 in the morning, and by 8:20 the world had turned its head. I didn't press send. I handed everything to a journalist I trusted years ago, Claire Ramos, who'd once written a profile about my father that had asked the right questions without getting sued. She took one look at the drive, read 3 documents, and then looked at me like someone who'd found a live wire. You understand what this will do? She asked. I understand what they already did, I said. Claire published within an hour. The headline was blunt: Horizon Black, How Orion Air Turned Civil Tech into a Global Weapon. The article quoted the audio chip, the hangar logs, the contract with Dahlstrom Aeronautics, and included a scanned copy of the final transmission. It named Victoria Hayes and Alan Vance in the lead paragraph. The cascade was immediate. Social feeds boiled into toxic threads analysts called in from Bloomberg, and my inbox flooded with messages ranging from venom to gratitude. The news desk called Noah within minutes. He texted back a single word: brace. Victoria's PR team was fast to rehearse statement within 90 minutes, asking for calm due process and the presumption of corporate confidentiality. It read like a recipe for obfuscation, the sound of a falling hammer wrapped in velvet, A lot of words, a little meaning. Alan posted an image of a sunrise with the caption, "Innovation must be protected." He was predictable and theatrical. His comments were the same ones men use when they think complexity hides wrongdoing. But the press doesn't wait for statements. Regulators do. By noon, FAA investigators were on site at Orion's headquarters. The Department of Justice had opened a preliminary inquiry. Shareholders furious demanded emergency action. Several significant investors froze new funding. The board convened a crisis meeting that I learned later lasted for 7 hours and descended into finger-pointing and profanity. I watched most of it unfold from a small cafe a few blocks from the tower, Claire beside me, Noah on a conference call with a source in Stockholm. Grace had arranged secure lines and sat in the corner with a pile of photocopies, her expression careful, like someone who'd watched secrets like this accumulate and finally had permission to exhale. The first public crack came at 3 when Victoria appeared on live television. She flattened her smile into something almost human and said, "I have full confidence in the integrity of our partners and the transparency of our processes. These accusations are serious, and we will cooperate with authorities." Her voice was even. She sounded like a woman reading from a script written by a lawyer who'd practiced soothing wealthy audiences for decades. 2 things happened before the hour was out. First, a whistleblower from Dahlstrom walked into an embassy and handed over a cache of emails proving communications with Alan Vance. Second, a coalition of Orion pilots released a statement they refused to fly any aircraft running Skylink code until independent audits were completed. Overnight cancellations wiped millions off the stock. My phone buzzed constantly, a drumbeat of chaos and confirmation. Friends I'd lost touch with messaged offers of help. Strangers messaged death threats. The hackers who live under every corporation's bed started digging and posted financial trails showing shell companies linked to Hayes Holdings. Someone found my father's old notes on a corporate server he'd thought was deleted. They were everywhere, embedded like splinters in the company's bones. At 6 p.m., the board called an emergency shareholder meeting for the following week. News anchors declared it a possible corporate coup. Victoria's internal allies sent thinly veiled threats through lobbyists and legal teams. Alan scheduled interviews where he called the allegations the noise of failed ambition. He wore a new tie and acted as if outrage could be tied up with a different knot. But the clearest reaction came from within our own house, a call from an old family friend who still had the nerve to speak plainly. "Emma," he said, voice low, "they're circling the wagons. Victoria's donors are mobilizing. If you want to bring them down, be ready for a fight that will make everything you've already done look tidy." I had thought at first that exposure would be the lever that moved mountains. I hadn't banked on the subterranean networks of influence that moved them back into place. The truth had blown the door off the hinges, but it didn't mean the house would collapse on command. It meant we'd have to dismantle it beam by beam. Claire wanted to host the next piece. "We need victims," she said. "We need the pilots, the engineers who were told to keep silent, and the families of the countries affected. People care about faces." I agreed. We planned interviews, assembled the tapes, rehearsed the narrative. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted accountability, but I couldn't pretend the spectacle wouldn't be necessary. That night I met Noah and Grace in my apartment. We spread printouts across the table like themselves assembling pipeline. They tracked transfers from Hayes Holdings into discrete accounts tied to offshore research entities, and the paper trail led to a lobbying network that had placed agents in both defense committees and procurement offices. This was larger than greed. This was deliberate architecture. "You realize what happens now," Noah said. "They'll go after Claire. They'll start lawsuits. They'll leak parts of your past to muddy the water. They'll turn it personal." "I've already been personal," I said, thinking of the dinner, the email from HR, the cold, empty apartment. They stripped my name clean. The question now is whether they stripped my voice. Grace folded her hands. "They'll try to discredit you with the same old tactics. But you have receipts. You have the final transmission. You have pilots and engineers willing to talk. The world's watching. Outside the city lights blurred into a ribbon of gold. Inside our pile of evidence gleamed under the lamplight an odd kind of beauty and paperwork. I felt tired in a new way. Not the raggedness of loss, but the focused exhaustion of someone who'd entered a fight sober. Before bed, I checked messages one last time. My stepmother had left a voicemail brief, measured the tone of someone apologizing for something unnamed. I didn't listen to it twice. Instead, I opened an email from Claire with a single-line subject, "We go live at 9. Be ready." I turned off my phone for a few minutes, just to hear my own pulse, to remember that underneath every tweet and leak and legal brief, there was a woman who had been fired at a restaurant and left with a form letter at night. I slept like a person who knows the storm is coming, but has nowhere left to hide. The sky had been publicized. The runway was packed. The takeoff wouldn't be graceful. It wouldn't be clean. But this time the lift wasn't just for me. It was for the pilots who refused to fly blind, for the engineers who'd been silenced, for a father who'd tried to stop what his name became. When morning came, the world would have to choose a side. I only hoped the gravity would finally start answering back. The morning after Claire's segment, the city felt different, louder, more electric, like a terminal at rush hour, where every departure board showed delayed, and people were suddenly paying attention to the small print. My inbox filled with messages I'd been too numb to imagine a week before: subpoenas, interview requests, offers from watchdog groups, and one from a coalition of commercial pilots asking for a meeting. For the first time since the dinner, where they'd humiliated me, people were asking me questions that mattered. By 9, the DOJ had issued a statement confirming a preliminary inquiry. By 11, 2 senators demanded an emergency hearing. Victoria released another statement, firmer, combative. This time, Orion remained committed to public safety and would cooperate with investigations. Her words tried to sound conciliatory, but they carried the brittle edge of someone who still believed reputation could be rebuilt with enough PR. She hadn't expected the internet to keep receipts. The smear campaign arrived like a corrosive cloud of data. Within hours, anonymous accounts resurrected old gossip, a rumor about a youthful indiscretion, a misquoted investor meeting clipped and repurposed. They tried to paint me as volatile, emotionally unstable, someone the press could excoriate between headline cycles. Legal teams circled Claire's newsroom. Hackers probed our servers. Someone leaked a childhood photo of my father and Victoria with the caption, "Family Feud sells papers." The strategy was classic: make the victim noisy, then make them less believable. It didn't work. The pilots' coalition was the turning point. Captain Ajay Singh, a man whose face had steadied thousands of takeoffs, sent an open letter to the FAA. "We refuse to become carriers of software that compromises control authority," he wrote. The letter included testimony from engineers who'd been threatened with non-disclosure agreements and payoffs. The public read about software that could reroute flights without crew consent and started asking the obvious question: if airlines could be commandeered, what else could governments co-opt? On day 3, shareholders sued for emergency oversight. The stock plunged like an engine losing all thrust. Victoria called an all-hands meeting that streamed live to anyone with a connection and a thirst for scandal. I watched from a small windowless room Claire had arranged for me at her media center. The feed showed Victoria at a podium, poised, practiced but faltering, when a reporter asked about the Dahlstrom contract. She avoided the word weapon, which in itself was a confession. Her lawyers were already whispering in her ear. That afternoon, Alan's chauffeur-driven car sat idle in a private garage, while 2 agents escorted him out. The camera footage looped on a dozen channels, him in waspish sunglasses, trying to smile past the cuffs. He had no time to salvage his performance. Watching him go, the sensation was strangely clinical, not triumph, but recognition of cause and effect. Men who think in ledgers rarely see the human fallout until it hits their ledger. Then they panic. My father's photograph appeared on television again, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself watch the grainy footage. He looked younger there, less burdened, as if the weight of later decisions hadn't condensed around his shoulders yet. A segment played his old interviews where he joked about the hubris of building machines that try to outsmart weather. I felt both angry and aching. He had been brilliant and flawed and tragically human. Calls came from unexpected places. A small NGO that monitors corporate arms dealing asked to expand their investigation. A European Union official requested access to the files I'd handed Claire. Invitations to testify began to multiply. I hired a lawyer through a recommendation Claire had kept in reserve for moments like this, someone who had handled whistleblowers and had a taste for complicated ethics. Elena's voice, calm and assured, grounded me. "We'll control the narrative where we can," she said. "We'll keep you safe where we must." Not everyone was pleased. My stepmother's friends circulated frantic emails behind closed doors. They convened fundraisers in private rooms to secure legal cover called favors and tried to buy silence with promises of settlements that smelled of old money. The world had watched Victoria host galas where her donors clinked champagne like gavel strikes. Now those donors were choosing whether to back a legacy tied up in secrecy or protect their own reputations. At a hearing that week, I sat on camera face lit by fluorescent lights and a dozen lenses. I answered questions from committee members who wielded their power like scalpels sharp and efficient. I spoke about code and test protocols about a father who had realized too late the potential of his invention. I told them the story of the hangar recording the file labeled Final Transmission, and how my father's last words had been a plea for restraint. The room fell quiet when I recounted the exact phrase he used, "destroy it." On cable TV that evening, a pundit tried to reduce everything to family drama. Corporate infighting, he called it. Greed dressed up as conscience. That line felt like sand in my mouth. This wasn't a soap opera. This was aviation safety and human lives. The pilots' families knew that. So did the communities and countries where Dahlstrom's contracts had the potential to destabilize airspace. The rhetoric of spectacle couldn't contain the gravity of potential casualties. The personal cost sharpened in petty, piercing ways. My landlord emailed a passive-aggressive notice about noise, though I'd been careful to keep hours. The boutique gym canceled my membership due to reputational alignment. But small indignities were easy to digest compared to what I saw at the courthouse entrance. A man with a Hayes Holdings tie who'd once smiled in my father's shadow, now avoiding my eye as if illumination had become a contagion. Privilege thinned quickly when the world demanded ethics over optics. That night after the hearings, I walked home across a bridge where wind pried at my coat, and the river under me murmured like a long, slow thought. The city lay glowing, indifferent, and magnificent. Claire texted me a photograph of the front page horizon black the dawn after the dusk. Her caption, "They couldn't stop the sunrise." I smiled despite everything. There's a moment in every unraveling when you realize you've traded private survival for public scrutiny. It's a bargain, painful, necessary. I had wanted to reclaim my name without spectacle to extract truth like a surgeon removes a tumor. Instead, the truth became public theater. But the point of a reveal is not applause. It's accountability. The pilots could refuse to fly. The regulators could keep records. The justice system could file charges. Those were the real engines of change. As I climbed the stairs to my temporary room that night, I felt fatigue like a physical weight and a fierce, unquiet determination, not the hunger for revenge that fed my early plans, but the steadier fuel of someone who'd watched the sky be weaponized and vowed to rechart its course. The fractures in flight had begun to show. Now the hard, long work of rebuilding started, and I had no intention of letting them repaint the hull over the cracks. The morning Victoria was arrested, the sky over Manhattan was the same color as the company's old logo, metallic gray, sterile corporate. News broke just before 7. I was sitting at my kitchen table halfway through a cup of coffee gone cold when the notification hit my phone. Federal agents detain Hayes Holdings CEO in connection to Horizon investigation. They took her outside her townhouse on Fifth Avenue. No makeup, no curated expression, just a woman in a black coat who finally realized that cameras were no longer her allies. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just pressed her lips together like someone who'd spent her life controlling every narrative and couldn't find the right line for this one. Within minutes, footage looped across every network. The cuffs, the crowd, the statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming charges of corporate espionage fraud and endangerment. The words felt clinical, too neat for the wreckage they represented. Alan's name appeared next, attached to a new indictment: conspiracy, embezzlement, obstruction. His lawyer, pale and perspiring, offered a flimsy excuse about misinterpretation of standard corporate practices. A man who once dined with senators was now eating off a metal tray. I thought I'd feel vindicated, maybe even relieved. Instead, I felt something emptier, quieter. Justice never looks like revenge in real time. It looks like paperwork, flashing lights, and silence where power used to speak. By noon, reporters had stationed themselves outside every address associated with the Hayes family. Headlines evolved by the hour, empire in freefall, from innovation to infamy. My father's name trended again: Robert Hayes, the visionary whose daughter had dismantled his legacy to save it from corruption. I spent most of that day fielding calls from people who once avoided me. Former colleagues who suddenly always believed in me, professors asking for quotes, acquaintances offering interviews. I declined them all. I wasn't done yet. Grace came over with printouts from the SEC filings. "They're liquidating assets," she said, dropping the papers on the table. "Everything tied to Orion is frozen. The board's resigning one by one." I looked at the numbers. "How much will the victims get?" "Depends on how deep the restitution fund goes," she said. "But it's real this time. They can't bury it in arbitration anymore." Noah arrived an hour later, worn out but smiling. "You should see Alan's face in the deposition videos. He's unraveling. Tried to blame you, said you manipulated data and coerced employees." I raised an eyebrow. "Creative." "He broke the moment they played your father's recording," Noah said. "You could see it hit him, the guilt he never admitted to having." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the city hummed like nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. The empire that had built our lives and broken them was collapsing in real time, and the world was watching. By evening, Claire's follow-up documentary aired, "The Woman Who Grounded the Skies." It wasn't about spectacle. It was about the cost of conscience. Footage of my father's test flights, interviews with engineers, the whistleblowers who'd come forward after the hearings. Then the last image, me walking out of the courthouse, anonymous among a sea of faces. Claire's voice narrated over it. She didn't bring down an empire. She reminded the world that even in the sky, gravity still exists. The line hit harder than I expected. I turned off the television and stood by the window. Rain slicked the streets below, blurring the lights into ribbons of silver. Somewhere down there, people were still hailing cabs, buying dinner, living ordinary lives, untouched by boardrooms and secrets. I envied them, but only a little. My phone buzzed a new voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. When I played it, a familiar voice filled the room. "Emma, this is Dylan. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know I testified." I told them everything about the transfers, the offshore accounts, how Mom ordered Alan to cover up your father's death. She called it an accident because admitting sabotage would ruin the brand. I should have come forward sooner. "I'm sorry. For everything." I sat down slowly. Dylan, my half-brother, had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the spotlight, while Victoria orchestrated the family like a business. Hearing his voice now felt like an echo from a different life. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in carrying my father's ghost. The next morning, the world learned what Dylan's testimony confirmed: my father's crash hadn't been pilot error. The flight control system had been remotely overridden from a test terminal at Orion headquarters. The report named Alan as the operator and Victoria as the approving authority. Containment required the phrase from my father's recording had been code for silencing him permanently. The revelation hit harder than any headline before it. It turned a scandal into a murder case. The following week, I stood in the courtroom as the prosecutor played the black box audio. My father's last words filled the room again, but this time they weren't secret. His voice trembled. Fading under static, "Tell Emma the sky isn't theirs to own." When it ended, the silence was unbearable. Victoria stared straight ahead, face frozen, mascara streaked. Alan couldn't lift his head. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The verdict came hours later, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was a formality. I only heard the word guilty. The House of Hayes had fallen. That night I walked alone to the river where the city lights reflected like constellations on the water. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe without expectation. The air was cold. The wind steady, and somewhere above a plane crossed the night sky, a machine built for freedom, not control. My father's empire was gone, but his dream had survived in the one place they couldn't touch it, in the people who refused to be silent. I whispered to the wind the way I used to as a child, sitting on the hangar steps beside him. "You were right," I said. "The sky remembers." And in the hum of engines far above, I could almost hear him answer. The courthouse emptied slowly like a storm that didn't know it was over. Reporters shouted my name as I stepped into the hallway, their microphones extended like a thicket of hostile antennae. I kept walking. The echo of my father's voice still hung in the air, and every question felt static. Outside, the air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. A thin drizzle had begun to fall, blurring the flashing cameras into orbs of light. Noah met me at the steps, holding an umbrella. He didn't say anything at first, he didn't have to. We both knew silence was the only language that fit this moment. When we finally reached the car, he said quietly, "They'll appeal." "Of course they will," I replied. "People like Victoria always believe one more statement can rewrite history." He glanced at me. "You could disappear now, you know, leave all of this behind." I looked through the windshield at the courthouse doors where agents were escorting the last of the Orion executives out in handcuffs. I said, but I won't. The appeal was inevitable. Victoria's lawyers filed motions within 48 hours citing procedural errors and undue media influence. It didn't matter. The evidence was too clean, the money trail too precise. The system had been built to protect them, but for once the weight of their own greed tipped the scales. Still, the days that followed felt strange, hollow, in a way victory never admits. My name was everywhere again, Emma Hayes, whistleblower, daughter of a fallen empire. They made documentaries about me before I'd even learned how to sleep without waking at 3 a.m. to check if the files still existed. Fame was just another form of surveillance, I realized. The world had replaced my silence with noise. One morning I visited my father's grave in Vermont. The ground was damp from rain and the wind carried the faint scent of pine. His headstone was simple as he'd wanted Robert Hayes. Engineer, dreamer, father. I stood there for a long time before placing a single silver gear from the Orion prototype at its base. "You tried to warn me," I said softly. "You told me the sky wasn't theirs to own." I didn't listen until it was almost too late. The breeze shifted rustling through the trees like an answer I couldn't quite catch. When I returned to the car, a black sedan was parked behind mine. Dylan stepped out, his coat collar turned up against the wind. For a moment we just looked at each other. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been testifying under fluorescent lights, voice trembling as he confessed everything he'd hidden for years. "I didn't think you'd want to see me," he said. "I didn't," I admitted. "But I'm glad you came anyway." He nodded, eyes downcast. "Mom's refusing to eat. She keeps saying it was supposed to be about legacy." "It was," I said, "just not the kind she wanted." We walked along the gravel path in silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, almost ashamed. "I didn't know how much she controlled until it was too late." "You were right about everything." "No," I said. "I was just too angry to be afraid." He smiled faintly. "That's why you survived." Before he left, he handed me a small box. "Dad kept this in his desk," he said. "I found it after the trial. I think it's meant for you." Inside was a brass compass, old but still polished, the needle trembling slightly as if remembering the motion of flight. On the back, engraved in his handwriting, were 3 words, "Find true north." For the first time since everything began, I cried, not the loud, shattering kind of grief that comes from loss, but the quiet release of someone who's carried too much weight for too long. Weeks passed. The world moved on to new scandals, new tragedies. But somewhere between the headlines, real change began. The FAA announced new oversight measures for autonomous flight systems. Congress introduced the Hayes Act legislation requiring transparency in defense tech partnerships. Engineers from Orion and other companies formed an independent ethics coalition, using my father's name not as a brand, but as a warning. I attended none of the ceremonies. I'd had enough of cameras. Instead, I spent my days consulting anonymously for smaller aviation startups, young engineers, trying to build with integrity in an industry that rewarded speed over safety. They didn't know who I was at first, and that anonymity felt like freedom. Then one evening, while reviewing a prototype schematic for a small firm in Seattle, I noticed a familiar symbol etched in the design, a stylized horizon line open and unfinished. The founder, a woman barely 30, smiled when she saw me looking at it. "Your father's work inspired this," she said. "We're calling it Project Aurora, an aircraft that flies by human instinct, not automation. A system that remembers the pilot's hand." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My father's dream flight as connection not control was alive again, rebuilt by strangers who'd never met him, but understood what he'd meant to the sky. Later that night, I walked to the waterfront. The city lights shimmered against the waves, the same rhythm I'd watched from my apartment so many sleepless nights ago. I thought about everything that had been destroyed and everything that had been rebuilt from its ashes. Noah joined me there, hands in his pockets, the cold wind tugging at his coat. "You did it," he said simply. "No," I replied. "We did." He chuckled softly. "You always deflect." "I'm tired of the story," I said. "I'd rather build something worth telling." He looked at me, eyes steady. "Then where do you go from here?" I glanced toward the horizon, the compass heavy in my palm. "Forward," I said. "Always forward." For a long time we stood there without speaking, the distant hum of planes overhead threading through the night. Each one seemed lighter than before, unburdened maybe by the weight of secrets. When Noah left, I stayed. I pulled out my phone and opened a blank document, typing a single line at the top: "The sky remembers." It wasn't a headline or a statement or even a message. It was a promise to myself, to my father, to the countless others who had lost and rebuilt in silence. By midnight, the rain had stopped. The clouds cleared, revealing a sliver of moonlight stretching across the water. Somewhere far above, a jet traced its path through the dark, steady and sure. And for the first time in years, I didn't see a machine built for power. I saw what my father always saw, the fragile grace of humanity learning over and over again how to rise. 6 months after the verdict, New York had softened. The snow on the sidewalks melted into silver puddles that reflected the new headlines, ones that no longer carried my name. The city had returned to its rhythm of forgetting, and for the first time I was grateful for its indifference. I rented a small office on the 12th floor of an old building in Tribeca. The paint peeled in places, the windows stuck when it rained, and the radiator hissed like a secret being pulled from iron lungs. But it was mine. No boardrooms, no security badges, no ghosts of power suits pacing behind glass. Just a desk, a laptop, and the low hum of a coffee machine that never judged the hour. The plaque on the door read, "Horizon Ethics Consultancy." Claire had laughed when I told her the name. "You're still haunting them," she said. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I'm reclaiming the word." Clients trickled in slowly at first. Startups, research teams, a few venture firms trying to untangle themselves from the ethical quicksand of old tech empires. They came because they were afraid of becoming the next headline. They stayed because they realized I wasn't here to punish. I was here to rebuild. Most days were quiet. I'd review contracts, draft compliance frameworks, speak with engineers about transparency and risk. But some days the quiet broke an email from an old Orion employee wanting to testify in another case, or a journalist asking for a quote about corporate moral responsibility. Those were the days I turned off my phone and walked to the river where the wind sounded like freedom wearing patience. Dylan called once a week. He was in therapy working at a small renewable energy firm upstate. "I still feel like I owe him," he said once, meaning our father. "You don't owe him," I said. "You honor him." He was the only family I had left, and strangely, that was enough. We didn't talk about Victoria much. Her appeal had failed. She was serving a 20-year sentence in a minimum security facility in Connecticut, writing letters to senators that would never be read. Alan was somewhere in federal custody trading cufflinks for cafeteria tokens. The empire they'd built on illusion had been stripped to rubble, and somehow I'd walked out of the fire intact. One morning, a letter arrived addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short note written on heavy cream stationery. Your father once told me that integrity is just another form of flight hard to maintain, easy to lose altitude. He would have been proud of you. A.S. Alan's initials. The handwriting trembled uneven, as if written by someone who'd aged 50 years in 6 months. I didn't know if it was an apology or absolution. I folded the note and placed it in the same box as my father's compass. Later that afternoon, I met Claire for coffee. Her documentary had been nominated for a Pulitzer, though she waved it off when I congratulated her. "Don't you miss it?" she asked, stirring her espresso. The fight, the adrenaline, I thought about it. The hearings, the exposure, the endless nights spent untangling lies from half-truths. It had felt like flying through turbulence without instruments. "No," I said finally. I miss believing the fight would end once the truth came out. But truth doesn't end anything. It just changes the battlefield. She smiled almost sadly. "And yet you're still in it." "Someone has to be," I said. The following week, I flew to Geneva for a global aviation ethics summit. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same industry that had tried to silence me was now inviting me to speak. I stood at the podium before an audience of engineers, regulators, and CEOs in suits that whispered money. The topic on the screen behind me read, "Reclaiming the Sky Technology, Power and Responsibility." "I'm not here to talk about blame," I began. "Blame is easy. I'm here to talk about consequences. The systems we build will outlive us. They'll carry our fingerprints, not just our intelligence, but our arrogance, our shortcuts, our silence." A murmur moved through the room. Some of them shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. I continued. My father believed flight was an act of faith, not in machines, but in the people behind them. He said technology should never replace accountability, it should illuminate it. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. When I stepped off stage, the applause was quiet but genuine. Afterwards, an older woman approached me, Isabella Ruiz, the venture capitalist, who had once offered me a partnership in Barcelona. "You turned the wreckage into a compass," she said. "Few people know how to do that." "Only because I learned what it feels like to fly blind," I replied. She offered me her card again. "If you ever want to scale this beyond consulting, build something global, something self-sustaining, call me." That night I walked along the edge of Lake Geneva, the lights of the city glimmering across the water. I thought about what she'd said. Scaling meant exposure risk headlines. But it also meant influence. It meant rewriting the system from inside the cockpit. When I returned to New York, I found an email waiting in my inbox, subject Aurora Project Partnership Proposal. Attached was a technical brief from the same Seattle firm that had reignited my father's dream, a new prototype designed for atmospheric mapping and humanitarian missions. The tagline read, "Built to serve, not to control." At the bottom was a note, "We'd like Horizon Ethics to be our governance partner." I read it twice, then looked at the compass on my desk. The needle steadied toward the north. 3 days later, I signed the partnership papers. Aurora would launch within 2 years the first aircraft built entirely under transparent ethical review. Every line of code, every circuit, every decision open to public scrutiny. It wouldn't erase the past, but it would give meaning to the wreckage. On the night of the signing, I walked to the rooftop of my office building. The city stretched beneath me, alive with noise and neon. Planes crossed the skyline in quiet arcs, their navigation lights blinking red and white, tiny symbols of endurance. I closed my eyes and remembered my father's voice. The sky isn't theirs to own. It wasn't. It never would be again. The wind rose sharp and clean, carrying the scent of rain and jet fuel, and something like promise. I stood there until the last light disappeared into the horizon, no longer haunted by the past, but guided by it. And as the city exhaled around me, I realized the silence I'd feared for so long wasn't emptiness. It was freedom, the kind that doesn't need applause, the kind that lets you finally look up without flinching. The horizon was no longer theirs. It was ours. The morning aurora took its first flight, the world felt still. No flashbulbs, no politicians cutting ribbons, no speeches about innovation, just a hangar on the edge of the Mojave Desert, and a small team of engineers who believed that flight could mean something again. I stood on the tarmac in a windbreaker hair pulled back, watching the dawn light spill across the wings. The plane shimmered like a living thing, matte silver, sleek but unpretentious, with the horizon emblem painted in deep blue on its tail. It wasn't the mark of an empire. It was a promise. Ready for the ignition test, the flight director called from the comms tent. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. This was the culmination of years of dismantling and rebuilding, of choosing purpose over vengeance. Noah stood beside me, holding a clipboard he didn't need. His grin was quiet but proud. "Your father would have loved this," he said. "He built the dream," I answered. "We just had to repair the wings." The engines hummed to life, a sound softer than I expected. Not the roar of conquest, but the steady breath of precision. The air rippled sand lifting at our feet, and I found myself whispering the same thing I'd said the day the verdict was read: "The sky remembers." And it did. As aurora-lifted sunlight struck its surface, scattering brilliance across the horizon. The team erupted, the sound echoing sharply in the massive hangar. I just stood there motionless, watching it climb. For a heartbeat, I saw my father's reflection in the glass. Not as he'd died, but as he'd lived, laughing, hopeful, alive, with that impossible faith that people could do better if they chose to. When the plane disappeared into the distance, I finally exhaled. The ache I'd carried for years didn't vanish, but it shifted from grief to gratitude, from loss to legacy. That afternoon, we gathered inside the hangar to watch the flight feed. The cockpit view streamed to the monitors, desert unfolding into gold, and rose the horizon curving like an open hand. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. "Altitude 20,000 and climbing. System stable. Feels like she's guiding herself." The engineers cheered. Noah squeezed my shoulder. "You did it, Emma. You turned their empire into something human again." "No," I said softly. "We turned it into something alive." 2 weeks later, Aurora made headlines across the world, not for breaking speed records, but for transparency. Every part of its design, every ethical audit, every community investment was made public. People didn't just trust it. They believed in it. That night, I returned to my apartment for the first time in days. On my kitchen counter sat the compass my father left me. I picked it up, turning it in my hand until the needle pointed north. True north. I understood it now. It wasn't a direction. It was a decision, the point where purpose meets peace. The following spring, I visited Vermont again. The snow had melted into the river, and wildflowers pressed through the thawed earth around his grave. I sat cross-legged beside the stone, tracing his name with my fingertips. "I kept going," I said, "even when it hurts, even when it meant burning everything down to start over." The wind rustled through the trees, warm this time, almost tender. Somewhere in the distance, a plane passed overhead, a faint silhouette against the blue. I smiled. "You were right, Dad. The sky never belonged to them. It belonged to us, the ones who kept believing in it." When I rose to leave, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the path. Dylan. His hands were in his pockets, his hair longer, his face lined but peaceful. "I didn't want to interrupt," he said. "You're not interrupting." He looked at the grave for a long time before speaking again. "She wrote me a letter," he said. "Mom, from prison. Said she finally understands what she destroyed. Asked me to tell you she's sorry. I didn't ask to see it. I didn't need to. Do you believe her?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I think she believes in herself." "That's enough," I said. And it was. Before he left, he handed me a photo, the last picture of our father standing beside the prototype hangar, sunlight on his face. Behind him, barely visible, was the word Aurora stenciled on a crate. I hadn't noticed it before. He'd chosen that name long before we ever did. After Dylan left, I walked back toward my car. My reflection caught in the window, older, sharper, but lighter somehow. For years I'd measured myself against the shadow of what I'd lost. Now I saw the outline of what I'd built instead. In June, Aurora completed its humanitarian mission delivering medical equipment to flood zones in Southeast Asia. The media called it the Redemption Flight. I didn't correct them. Let them have their headline. I knew what it really was, proof that healing could take shape, metal and wind, and be intertwined. The night it returned safely, I hosted the team at the hangar. No champagne, no red carpet. Just laughter paper plates and the kind of peace that comes from work done right. Noah clinked his glass against mine. So what now? I looked at the stars spilling across the desert sky. Now we build more. Not planes, people. Teams that don't need permission to do good. He grinned. Still the same Emma Hayes, always turning fire into flight. Someone has to, I said. When everyone left, I stayed behind. The hangar was quiet except for the steady ticking of cooling engines. I walked to the open door and looked out at the dark horizon. The air smelled like metal ozone and the faint sweetness of desert rain. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who flinched every time someone said her father's name. The woman who buried her voice beneath anger and survival. The leader who nearly became what she hated just to prove she could win. And then I thought about who I was now, not victorious, not vengeful, free. As I turned to leave, the faintest breeze swept across the runway, whispering through the steel beams above. I closed my eyes and let it pass through me, carrying with it everything I no longer needed. When I opened them again, the horizon was painted in faint gold. The kind of light that doesn't shout. The kind that promises. I smiled. "Good morning, Dad," I whispered. Then I walked out into the dawn, not chasing the sky anymore, but walking beside it. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need wings to